During the Vietnam War, brave American service members found themselves under constant threat from the enemy. But while the war is bad enough, some of them had even worse things to contend with. When they returned home, they shared stories of things that they never knew existed, things that seemed too determined to undermine their safety, things that came from both the war-torn jungle itself and down from the skies over Southeast Asia. You won't want to miss this one. From 1955 to 1975, conflict raged across Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Known today in America as the Vietnam War, the battle pitted communist forces in North Vietnam against South Vietnam. Now, the war had major geopolitical consequences because while the conflict was officially local, the North was supported by the Soviet Union, China, and other communist states, while the South was supported by the United States of America and the other anti-communist allies. Now, this led to millions of American troops being deployed to the region until the fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975. Unfortunately, some never returned home. Those who did carried their battle scars with them. Still others had stories so bizarre no one believed them. One service member who returned to share such a story was Gary Linderer. Now, Gary served with the 101st Airborne Division, and he clearly remembers running into something that wasn't human while on patrol with 5 other men behind enemy lines. So Gary and his fellow soldiers had been pushing through the Central Highlands for days and were absolutely exhausted. You see, the mountains in this region meant that you were almost always going uphill, and even when you weren't, you had to cut across slopes with one leg lower than the other. In short, it was incredibly fatiguing. Not even sleeping brought any comfort because instead of lying on flat ground, you had to wedge yourself between the trees to keep yourself from rolling downhill. It was one of these exhausting days that Gary and the other 5 soldiers decided to take a break. They took off their packs and sat down, all of them facing outward so they couldn't be ambushed by the Viet Cong. For a while, nothing happened, and nothing was heard, other than the usual sounds of the forest. And then, without a warning, a commotion erupted about 15 yards up the hill from where they were resting. Something was shaking the underbrush violently, putting all 6 men on high alert. Well, Gary bolted upright and readied his firearm. He was sure that an ambush from the enemy was imminent. He trained his rifle on the bushes, barely able to keep his aim steady. His heart was beating so fast, he stood there waiting for a firefight to erupt at any moment. In his book, Very Crazy GI, author Craig P. Jorgensen described that while he was ready for a VC soldier, Gary wasn't ready for the face that peered through the underbrush. An oblong head framed the hair-covered face, dark, deep-set eyes lay beneath a prominent brow, and they did nothing to complement the heavy jowls and angry mouth. As it stepped into a small clearing, Linderer could see that matted reddish-brown hair ran down this thing's neck and covered most of its body. Whatever it was, it stood at least 5 feet tall, had broad shoulders, long, thick, muscular arms, and a heavy torso. And it walked upright. In the small clearing, it stopped and studied the Americans. So Gary's just aimed at this thing and is completely unsure what to do. From behind him, he hears someone call out, "What the hell is that?" Then, from one of his other brothers in arms, Gary hears someone else shout, "It's a rock ape." Then another man chimes in, "No, it ain't. I've seen rock apes and that sure as hell isn't a rock ape." Now finally, Gary, never taking his aim off of this thing, yells, "It's an orangutan, isn't it?" Well, if it is, then he can't read a map because there are no orangutans in Vietnam. Now, luckily for them, the encounter ended when the ape lost interest and melted back into the forest, but other soldiers serving in Vietnam weren't so lucky. You see, Gary and his fellow soldiers had encountered something that numerous Vietnam veterans reported during their tour of duty overseas. The rock apes, named because of how they like to throw stones at soldiers in the jungle. But while the GIs called them rock apes, the Vietnamese had different names for their local Bigfoot. You see, for years, locals in Vietnam have spoken of a race of upright, hairy creatures that went by a variety of names like Bat Tut and Ngoi Rung. In case this sounds made up, you should know that it wasn't just an urban legend. Not only do we have sworn testimony from numerous servicemen with impeccable records, but the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army themselves took the stories of the rock apes very seriously. In fact, Hung Minh Thao, a colonel general in the People's Army of Vietnam, later organized a 1974 expedition to kill or capture one of the creatures. The expedition turned up empty-handed, but that doesn't mean that the stories are hard to find. Now, while Gary Linderer's encounter with a rock ape ended peacefully, a lot of others were much more violent. There are dozens of stories where American forces and these strange cryptids clashed in the jungles of Vietnam, resulting in actual casualties, usually on the side of the rock apes. As a matter of fact, an anonymous Marine reported that they had spent their whole tour in the Vietnam bush. They had seen rock apes alive and dead, and even had to kill one coming into lines one night. They never thought much of them, other than the fact that they were just apes. Although they did walk upright, were roughly 4.5 foot to 5 feet tall, and over 3/4 of the guy in this Marine's unit had seen them. One particularly dramatic encounter was actually shared by Marine Michael Kelly, who served with the 502nd Infantry and the 101st Airborne. In a letter written on November 25th, 2000, he detailed how his own detachment came face to face with the rock apes. You see, Michael said that he and his fellow Marines had often spotted the rock apes during the war. They could always be recognized by their telltale calls, which sounded like dogs barking. Well, on one occasion, Michael was about 9 miles south of the city of Hue when a squad of his platoon out on patrol spotted movement in the jungle. From out of nowhere popped a group of figures only around 30 feet down the trail. And so Michael, who was with the other 2 squads of the platoon, eating their lunch on the far side of a clearing about 50 meters wide that separated the 2 elements. The trails wound up the ridge and then through the clearing. And all of a sudden, without any warning, the lone squad opened up with everything they had: M16s, M79s, and hand grenades. Michael grabbed about 300 rounds of gun ammo and his M60, then ran across the clearing with the platoon sergeant to the cover of a huge toppled tree that was lying on the far side and close to the point of contact. The sergeant and Michael looked at one another, nodded, and then came over the top, ready to blast away, but what they saw instead, let's just say they weren't prepared for it. They found themselves looking at their men. Some were seated, some were standing, and some were even kneeling. And others were firing at these ghostly images swooshing around in the brush and trees in all directions. All except one of them was light brown to reddish brown in color and about 4 to 5.5 feet tall. Now, one dark, almost black, who was clearly a male, remained fighting to protect the others as they retreated, and he was flying through the branches and rushing the men with his teeth bared. And suddenly, the chaos just ended abruptly, like someone had just snapped their fingers and poof, it was all gone. The rock apes vanished, and there was no sight of them anywhere. The last thing he saw was the male running and disappearing into the trees and vanishing from sight. Now, in the moments that followed, Michael and his fellow Marines just had to process the situation. No one around them had been injured at all, even the rock apes. Michael said that all the chaos ended in an instant, for whatever the reason, as if someone had snapped their fingers, he would say, and all the rock apes vanished. The last thing he saw was the male turning around to disappear into the trees and out of sight. Now, up until the point where Michael had poked his head out from the tree, the firefight had been raging nonstop by this point, and when they poked their heads over the tree trunk, he and the sergeant were fully prepared to find a substantial detachment of NVA soldiers firing on their squad. Interestingly, it looked like the Vietnamese were attacking. And after all, according to Michael, the rock apes were about the size of people, and the coloration of their fur closely matched NVA uniforms. But Michael quickly noticed that none of them were firing back. And despite such a tremendous amount of firepower aimed in their direction, not one droplet of blood could be found anywhere in the immediate area. Now, Michael isn't sure if this was because the others had bad aim or if they were just firing warning shots. In the end, the only person to suffer from the incident was a soldier who had his eardrum burst after a particularly trigger-happy Marine was the first to open fire close to his head. Another Marine had this to share about a different incident, and this one published by Michael Mays of the website Texas Cryptid Hunter. The anonymous report reads this: In 1969, I spent my whole tour in the bush. One night, in ambush position, I had last guard duty before dawn. We were positioned on the outside edge of a tree line. About 15 minutes into my watch, I heard loud movement coming from a ways in the trees. As they got closer, I determined it to be a troop of monkeys. But as they got closer, I knew these were really big monkeys. They started making loud noises like they were yelling and just tearing up the jungle. As the twilight became brighter, I could see trees being shook, big trees that no human would be able to shake. I had a starlight scope mounted on my M16, but was never able to get a glimpse of what they were. There was so much racket going on, I wondered why the noise didn't wake any of the other guys. They kept getting closer, and I wondered if they knew we were there, but they were so close. I took the safety off the daisy-chained claymores and was on the edge of blowing them all when, all of a sudden, they just quit. It was lighter now, and I would have been able to see them, but they just vanished back into the jungle. It was so quiet, it was eerie. If they got hold of a human, I'm sure he would have been shredded. I always thought, what if they got just a little bit closer? How many would I have killed? Because I was certainly loaded for bear. Interestingly, the whole rock apes of Vietnam doesn't boil down to just a handful of minuscule sightings. It's been spotted many times by American and Vietnam soldiers alike. In fact, to a lot of residents of Vietnam, their existence is a matter of fact. No different than if you were to come over here and ask if black bears exist or cougars exist. Of course they do. So then we have to ask, why are they so elusive, and is there a supernatural component to them? I mean, if so many military personnel know about them, what's with all the secrecy regarding their existence? For now, the truth behind these mysterious beings remains a mystery. Normally, when Americans talk about the Vietnam War, we tend to focus on the United States side of the conflict, but every war has two sides. The Vietnam was no exception. While the primary adversaries for the US were the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army, they were supported extensively by the Soviet Union. In fact, from the summer of 1965 to when the fighting stopped, over 4,500 Soviet sergeants and soldiers were on the ground in Vietnam. And this is who our next story focuses on. In the summer of 1968, a team of Soviet engineers were stationed near the city of Cao Bang. Their job to construct a hydroelectric plant that would capitalize on the many waterfalls and rivers of the region. Well, all that changed the night of August 12th. Everyone had been sleeping soundly in their tents when a tremendous roar filled the jungle. When they finally woke up and came to their senses, the engineers immediately assumed that this was the sound of an American B-52 on a bombing run. One thought entered their heads at the same time: run. But something strange happened. A few of the men who thought to look up into the sky were surprised when they didn't see any American aircraft. Instead, they saw something beyond description. The best thing that they could compare it to was a large black diamond suspended in the sky about twice the size of the moon, and it glowed an eerie bluish green. Now, clearly this was not American technology, and as they watched, the Soviet engineers said that this first object was struck by a second object. Whether this was a missile or something else, whether it was friendly or enemy fire, no one could say. All they knew was that it went from the ground to the UFO, releasing a blinding flash upon impact. And so this explosion caused a massive shockwave that knocked everyone off their feet and absolutely obliterated the campsite. The tents were scattered everywhere along with their equipment, some of which lay in pieces. And then the men staggered to their feet, they shouted a roll call, and thankfully no one was injured. They just had the wind knocked out of them. But even this didn't calm everyone down. Now they're worried about what they saw might be some form of miniaturized nuclear technology, and they're absolutely petrified by the possibility of radiation poisoning. So they try using their radios to signal nearby friendly forces, but all they get is static. Now, it isn't until early the next morning that communication is reestablished, and after reporting the incident, the engineers promise a full write-up as soon as they are able. And now, in the meantime, they head into town for supplies, they ask around about what happened the night before, only to discover something truly strange. No one in the village ever recalled any sounds, other than a few people who mentioned hearing a thunderstorm in the distance. What's more, the village is in pristine condition. The blast seemed so intense at the campsite that the engineers were sure that there would be some signs of damage, but the community remained untouched. And so the researchers head back to base camp and do their best to put things back together again. And after about 2 days of this, one of the men decides to take a hike in the jungle, and what he discovers shocks him. There, nestled in the vegetation of the forest, about 1 kilometer away from camp, sits a perfect sphere. It's about 10 feet wide and is entirely black. Not only that, but it's perfectly black, meaning it doesn't seem to reflect any light at all. The man goes back to fetch his comrades, and as the other researchers visit the site, they notice more and more strange details. Not only does this globe not reflect any light, somehow it doesn't even cast a shadow. And by now it's late afternoon, and the light should be casting some sort of shadow on it, but it doesn't. Some of the braver men step forward and touch the sphere. Now the first thing that they notice is that it's cool to the touch, and they also note that the entire thing feels slippery, as if it's covered in some kind of film or doused in soapy water. Then, one of the men takes out a knife and begins probing for seams, and he doesn't find anything. And then he pulls the blade across the surface. No carving, no scratches, no marks. It's like a hole in reality. Well, the engineers naturally report this to their superiors over the radio. Instead of being surprised, the message they receive from higher up is quick and clear. Set up a perimeter around the sphere, stand guard, and wait for a special team to arrive and assess the situation. Under no circumstances, they are warned should they approach within 65 feet of the object. Now, the engineers get a sinking feeling. Remember, by this point, they've already violated that command. They hope that it's just their superiors being overly cautious rather than them knowing something about what the sphere can do. Well, the researchers do as they're told. 5 of them set up a perimeter 65 feet around the object and establish a secondary camp. Here, they build a small campfire and just try their best to rest. Those who don't fall asleep simply stare across the flames at the orb in the jungle, which can still easily be seen. Because it's so much darker than everything else around it, even at night, all they can do is wait for Soviet special forces to arrive on site. Now, one of the 5 men keeping guard is named Boris Ivanov, and he spends the night recording the hours in a diary, which is actually how we know about this story in the first place. Now, Boris says that everyone has their weapons at the ready, just in case something strange happens. And as it turns out, their firearms will be of no use. So, Boris says that the night dragged on and the fire began to die out. One of his co-workers, a fellow by the name of Vyacheslav, volunteers to head out into the jungle to collect some firewood, and he says he'll only be gone for a minute. But 5 minutes pass, Boris and the engineers begin calling his name, Vyacheslav, but the only response is their own voices echoing back. And now, everyone is growing more and more concerned by the minute. Now finally, a few of the men set off to find Vyacheslav with their flashlights, and they start in the direction of the sphere, but he isn't there. He's not outside the perimeter either. He's vanished without a trace. And so, instead of looking for their friend, the other engineers simply fall back to the campfire and wait. Maybe the special team will locate Vyacheslav on their way in. In the meantime, the sphere looms in the distance, an intimidating silence. Well, another hour passes, the fire dies down again, and another engineer named Peter volunteers to gather firewood. But before he gets up, Boris notices something. Something about Peter looks off. He's been rocking back and forth this entire time and looks absolutely drained. I mean, completely exhausted, more so than anyone else in camp. Instead of saying something, Boris watches as Peter sets off in the same direction as Vyacheslav, and he too vanishes into the night. By now, everyone is just terrified, but they're too afraid to go out looking for the missing men. Instead, they just cower around the campfire, hoping that either Dawn or the special forces will arrive soon and relieve them of their duty. 2 hours pass. Another man, this one by the name of Vladimir, does the same thing. The men beg him not to go, but he seems absolutely helpless to whatever is calling him into the jungle. He gets up, leaves, never returns. Now, only Boris and an engineer named Sergei are left, and they're rooted to the spot. Neither of them has any idea what is happening, but they know that they want no part of it. Despite how terrifying this night has become, both men slowly feel it, the pull, the call of something deeper within the forest. It soon becomes irresistible. Folks, is this starting to sound like some crazy science fiction movie or what? Somehow, Boris manages to keep his composure. But Sergei isn't so lucky. Boris watches as the remaining man staggers to his feet and something happens to Sergei's face. Now it's distorted, almost like a grimace. He stands and Boris watches as Sergei's hands and feet start to move, but they're not moving like they should. They're jerky, they're like puppeteered, they wobble kind of like a marionette. And so Boris begins to panic. He feels that same compulsion rising in himself. And he starts to wonder what, if anything, he can do to keep himself from becoming the sphere's final victim. And a thought strikes him. He hates the idea, but he sees no other way. And keep in mind, at this point, Sergei is staggering into the forest. And so Boris takes a deep breath, he readies his firearm, and he takes aim. And with more hesitation and regret than he has ever felt in his entire life, bam! Squeezes the trigger, sending a bullet directly into his own leg, meaning that he can no longer walk and can no longer be compelled away from the campsite. And so he passes out from the pain, and the last thing Boris sees is the jungle swallowing Sergei. Well, when Boris regained consciousness in the morning, he realized he was the only person remaining in the camp. While it was risky shooting his own leg, it might have been the only thing that saved his life. Now the jungle was alive, swarming with new Soviet soldiers, dispatched by Central Command to retrieve the sphere. One of them bends down and immediately starts administering first aid to Boris. Now, Boris has lost a tremendous amount of blood, and it's a miracle he didn't die. But he was at least able to resist the allure of the black sphere. Soon after, he was evacuated and his condition later stabilized. Unfortunately for Boris, the identity of the mysterious black sphere and the fate of his fellow engineers remains a mystery. Now, our last story is easily one of the weirdest to come out of the Vietnam War. In August of 1969, the United States 1st Marine Division was deployed near Da Nang. Among the soldiers was a man named Earl Morrison. Well, Earl experienced something truly bizarre one night that summer. It left such an impact on him that he refused to talk about it for 3 years. When he finally did step forward, he shared an encounter with something rarely seen by other people. Earl said that the night had proceeded as normal for several hours, meaning that while it was important to always keep watch, the men who were not on guard duty were either dozing, playing cards, or talking among themselves. As for Earl, he was sitting on top of a bunker with two other friends, and for the longest time it seemed like any other night while deployed. All of that changed early in the morning. Sometime between 1 and 1:30 in the morning, they spotted something in the sky. Earl noted that all of a sudden, all three of them happened to look up out in the sky, and they could make out this figure that was coming towards them. It was approaching very slowly, and the closer it got, they could start to make out that this figure had wings. And disturbingly, the wings were very similar to that of a bat, only a lot more gigantic. And this figure kept getting closer and closer, and they can now see it much more clearly. It was a woman, a naked woman, and her skin was jet black, her body was black, the wings were black. Now, I don't know about you guys, but immediately my mind goes to harpies. Okay, so you might be asking yourself at this point, hold on a second. It was in the middle of the night and this thing was entirely black, so how did these Marines even see it? Well, hold on. We'll get to that. Before you scream critical thinking, this woman began to glow. And it glowed in the night, this kind of greenish cast, and as she began approaching these three Marines, which by the way, they still hadn't heard anything, she hovered right above them. And as she got to where she was around maybe 6 or 7 feet directly above them, all three of them watched her go straight over the top of them, and she still didn't make any noise, even as she was flapping her wings. And she began to rise more and more, and would eventually blot out the moon. Now at this point, they could only define her outline because she glowed very bright. Then she made her way past the three Marines, heading straight towards the encampment. As she passed overhead and began moving away, they started hearing her wings flapping, and they watched her leave for quite a while until she disappeared altogether. When pressed for more details, Earl offered a few more specifics. Oddly, he said that the movement of this Batwoman's arms suggested that she had no bones. He also stated that the skin of her wings looked like it was molded onto her hands, and that's directly from him. Earl and the two other Marines couldn't do anything. They didn't know what they could do, so they just sat there frozen, and as you can imagine, they could not believe their eyes. The entire experience lasted probably 3 or 4 minutes at most. Now, disturbingly, these harpy-like beings have been spotted in other places around the world other than just Vietnam. While there are many stories and local legends of these beings in and around jungles like Vietnam and South America, it's no secret that the most popularized legends come from Greek mythology itself that detail harpies. However, we can create an entire video series on Greek mythology alone and harpies, so I'll leave that for a separate video. But it does make you wonder, doesn't it? Sadly, the identity of the strange, naked female harpy creature that kind of revealed itself to these three Marines remains inconclusive. And because you guys have made it this far into the episode, I'm going to give you guys an option. I think you guys should comment down below black sphere, so that way I know who made it to the end of the episode and who didn't. My writer thinks you guys should comment, "We built this city on rock April," so I know who made it to the end of the video and who didn't. And if you're a true lurker, you might just go ahead and write both. Jokes aside, if you guys enjoyed today's video and want to see more content like this where we dive into the mysterious and supernatural in a storytelling format, then you should totally go ahead and slap that like and subscribe button for more. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next video.